this CMEC podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, who is a former advisor to the Ministry of Defence and has enormous experience in the region, because as we speak, developments on the border of Lebanon are moving apace. I'm Charlotte Leslie and I'm the Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, and I'm here with Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall. Simon, thank you very much for joining us.
No, huge pleasure. Thank you very much, Charlotte. If ever there was a time where we could do with an organisation like CMEC, if I may say so, with some in-depth analysis, keeping people up to speed and trying to help them understand the sheer complexity of what's going on with so many spinning wheels, that we need a bit of dispassionate commentary to help listeners, viewers, readers, etc., try and get a better handle on this very dangerous situation we have in the Middle East.
On Friday, as we record, Israel launched strikes into southern Lebanon, and we now know assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah. Today we're hearing reports of a potential land invasion and tanks on the border of Lebanon. Can you talk us through what's happened in the last few days and where we are now?
Well, Israel really is doubling down. Whatever it's achieved in Gaza in terms of degrading the capability of Hamas, it now feels it has both the political will now in Israel. It's very interesting to see Netanyahu's polling figures. It has decided that it will no longer put up with 60,000 or more of its own citizens unable to occupy their own houses. And it feels that it has been provoked, and that Hezbollah brought this now on their own heads by piling in after the 7th of October atrocities and launching raids against Israel. So they've taken out Nasrallah. They, of course, had the extraordinary pager attack on the command structure of Hezbollah. They clearly are trying to attrit the very, very large stockpiles of ammunitions and munitions that Hezbollah have. And of course today they also struck and killed the head of Hamas in Lebanon, and a number of, I think, the People's Liberation Front, I can't remember which branch of Islamic Jihad. And meanwhile they're also striking in Hodeidah and possibly even Sana'a against the Houthis. So the gloves are definitely off, and of course the big question is, we expect Israel from a straight military point of view to prevail in both those. The Hezbollah will still be pushing out rockets, the Houthis will push out rockets. What's the response from Iran? These are proxies of Iran, hugely well supported in terms of money and munitions, so we'll see if their bluff has been called, because they know just precisely how weak they are or would be in a straight head-to-head military confrontation with Israel.
To what extent does removing the actors remove the movement? Hezbollah was born out of Israeli occupation in the 80s. If we remove Nasrallah, as we've done, does that solve the issue, or will something worse take its place?
It certainly doesn't solve the issue. I mean, the trouble with people like, dare I say, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're absolutely parasitic organisations. Doesn't mean they don't have a lot of support. But so much of the internal problems that the poor Lebanese have put up with over the last decade, 2 decades, has been generated by this fanatical organisation of Shia Arabs who are quite viscerally opposed to the Maronites, to the Druze, to many of the Sunnis, and who've driven Lebanon to the brink of bankruptcy. We could criticise the United Nations. UNSCR 1701 did ask or demand that Hezbollah will push back from the South Litani sector. They've not achieved that. Hence, they've continued to attack Israel and therefore brought this to extend on themselves. Wouldn't it be great if the state of Lebanon were able to reassert its own sovereignty within its borders? But at the moment, as I say, they will be nothing if they're not supported by Iran. And I think Iran is going to be very, very cautious about doing more than performative violence, which, having been on the receiving end of performative violence, does not make it any less unpleasant, but is designed not to tip into a state-on-state conflict. At the moment, these are not state-on-state conflicts. They're attacking Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, who are distinct terrorist, although popular organisations within fractured states, if you include Gaza as a state.
Speaking of states, in many ways, with the demise of the Lebanese state, Hezbollah was acting in a sense as a proxy state. Is there an opportunity for Lebanon to rebuild a non-Hezbollah state, or is it too fragmented? And is there anything that the West and the UK can do?
It's very difficult. It is so weakened by the economics. The infrastructure is really bad. There's no president at the moment. The extraordinary thing was the last president, Michael Aoun, was in alliance with the Hezbollah. The president was giving, and he was a Christian. The president was giving credibility to Hezbollah. The Lebanese armed forces, there's a certain amount of, I think it was the Lebanese ambassador in London was at least acknowledging that Western donors are trying to help up the credibility and the capability of the Lebanese armed forces. And that's ideally what a sovereign nation needs to be. It needs to have the monopoly of legitimate violence within its own borders. It's also worth remembering that it was thanks to Hezbollah's stockpiling of fertilizers that Beirut suffered the huge silo bomb, the largest man-made explosions almost since Nagasaki. So they have been a deeply, deeply unpleasant factor or fact of life within Lebanon. And again, let's not forget, the Hezbollah fighters are to be found in Yemen. They're to be found alongside the Russian Wagner group in the Sahel. They were very instrumental in keeping Assad in power, behaved absolutely barbarically against elements of the opposition. I know, again, that's a very large spectrum. So the capacity to bring real disaster on Lebanon in some ways should be laid very firmly at their door.
What difference does the possible prospect of a nuclear Iran have on the situation, and is that prospect realistic?
Well, it's something the Israelis are now going to be weighing up. How close is Iran to a breakout? I remember when I was in the Ministry of Defence back in 2009, one of the first issues we were at least looking around. We said, are we worse off with Iran with a bomb or a bombed Iran? Here we are, 16 years on, 15, 16 years on, and Iran still holding out the prospect it might become nuclear armed, but in some ways using it to distract from their activities, their malign activities in supporting Hamas, in supporting Hezbollah, in supporting the Houthis. And the Houthi one is a direct threat to maritime traffic at the moment, as we well know, and still building its ballistic capability. Meanwhile, of course, spending vast amounts of its own people's money on its malign activities and sort of thwarting the ambitions of its own highly cultivated, highly educated population. Were they to get a bomb, were they the assumption the bomb had got there without them crossing a threshold that provoked an attack, then I feel certain that the Saudi Arabians would try and get a similar capability. I feel certain the Turks and the Egyptians would also feel it was one thing having Israel as a nuclear power in the region, but now having the Persian Shia, a major regional power with major regional ambitions, having a nuclear weapon would really change the balance. So we are on quite a cusp, and I think the thing we need to look out for is just what response Iran now feels it has to do to preserve its own credibility with its proxies, allies, and supporters across the region. Because they are getting, and I think they've had it coming to them, well and truly thwacked or shellacked, as Barack Obama would have said, by the Israelis.
Speaking of Barack Obama and the US, again, as we record, we're looking forward to US presidential elections. I won't ask for predictions, but what are the implications of either Kamala Harris or a Trump presidency on this dynamic?
It's very difficult. I mean, Biden and the Democrats have presided over, I believe, a sort of diminution of American credibility, which to an extent came to a forefront with the withdrawal from Kabul. At the same time, of course, it is only America really that are keeping Ukraine in the fight. America has traditionally been a huge supporter of Israel. The worry is that it sends out very mixed messages at the moment, both by the actions of Biden, Harris, and by the words of Trump. And so everybody is a little uncertain, even the closest observers of the American political scene, about what the consequences would be, particularly in an area that, for the Americans, they find it very complex, confusing, and quite difficult to grasp the players. I think, you and I have discussed this before. An understanding of history and religion, cultures, connectivity, why people are doing things, is really important to work out where the pressure points are. One could argue that one of the things that's holding the Iranians back is, yes, American deterrence, a major, because they're very, very worried the Israelis might try and do a strike and draw the Americans in and say, look, we're going to do it, let's finish this now. So we're not even going to discuss the issue of Iran with a nuclear capability. It just will not have one. And one can say there was a time when they said if they did that, then they could spark up Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Well, they're all on the back foot at the moment. So the calculation with the IDF and the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu might be, this is a punch. The other people putting constraint on the Iranians, of course, are the Chinese. The Chinese do not want a conflagration in the Persian Gulf. They are hugely dependent on oil and gas coming out of the Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, in a way that America absolutely no longer is. Of course, it's an exporter. And even in the West, we're to an extent weaning ourselves off. So that paradigm has changed. But the vast 80% of the oil and gas coming out of the Strait of Hormuz now goes east. So there's two interesting dynamics playing in Tehran, even though clearly for different reasons.
Do you think China has any diplomatic weight when it comes to resolving the root causes of the Israel-Gaza conflict, Middle East peace? Or is that a mythology pushed by the CCP?
No, I think it does. It is a UN Security Council, Permanent Security Council member. And as I say, I think it has been very good at trying to broker the deal. I mean, it's slightly overtaken by events between Saudi Arabia and Iran for its own purposes. But there's a very interesting axis between Tehran, Moscow, and China. And of course, because of Moscow's failures in Ukraine, it's not to say how that's going to turn out. But in relative terms, Moscow and the relationship between Moscow and Beijing has changed dramatically in the 3 years of the Ukraine war. And undoubtedly, the Iranians are being looked on as a source of support for Moscow and its army. And equally, given Russia is on the back foot, they may feel some advantage in trying to keep the West or the proxies or the Europe, etc., distracted by, on the one hand, China say we don't want a conflagration. On the other hand, the Russians find it useful to drag the West into a morally difficult position, given the complexity of the whole Israel-Gaza Muslim world situation at the moment.
So we're here having this conversation and things are certainly coming to a head in a way that we've not seen for generations. But the underlying issues are pretty ancient ones, aren't they? I'm going to segue because I can't have you sitting here without talking about your recent book, The House of War. How do you see what we're seeing today, which is frightening? We feel like we're on the edge of a precipice of a new era. How does that fit in with the last 1,300 years? And I'll ask you to do that in a very short period of time.
Well, I think when I wrote the book, The House of War, it really was what I call applied history, because I do feel people are uncertain about the relationship between Turks, Iranians, Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt, the modern nuances where the Crusader kingdom is sort of seen as a forerunner of the state of Israel, the way that the Takfiris of ISIS or Al-Qaeda mine history for what I call historical entitlement, historical inspiration, and historical grievance. And I think, like anything, you owe it to parts of the world where you are involved to at least do the respect of trying to find out what you can. Empathy doesn't mean sympathy. Empathy at least requires you to reverse the gaze and say, how does this look from their point of view? And I think we've been poor at this. Iran is a classic example where our American friends really do view Iran through the prism of the 1979 overthrow of the Shah and the hostage crisis there. But of course, for Iran, Iran was a huge civilizational power. For century after century, the Achaemenids, the Sasanians, the Safavids, of course, after Islam, when they, a bit like the Roman Empire, adopting Christianity, the state religion, Shiism became the state religion of Iran. And they get really, I suppose, upset, sounds a bit pathetic word to use, that people don't give them the respect they deserve for their civilizational influence. And it's important that we can understand what motivates the Russians, what motivates Turkey, neo-Ottomanism, what motivates the Iranians over and above the rather more obvious modern, things of the Ayatollahs and the IRGC. Why do large numbers of Iranians feel a sort of connection to the state, even if they don't like their own government? Why do a lot of Turks feel very strongly about their own history under the Ottomans? Why do a lot of Arabs, of course, feel very strongly about being the guardians of Mecca, Medina, the early caliphates, Egypt, with its pre-Islamic? So I think the House of War tries to, and of course it is, the headline story is up to a point, armies of the caliphate against armies of, I use it loosely, Christendom. The backdrop, of course, is a much more complex story about splits, divisions, war within the Islamic world, against competing caliphates, and equally within a Christian world divided between the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Protestant and the Catholic, the fight between the English and the French, the fight between the Valois and the Habsburgs. So in a single volume, it tries to use 10 great battles and sieges, which are headlined, they're all epic, they're all historical, one or two are absolutely historically decisive, but to set the context and say, how come people are very selectively using history? But if you know the history, at least you have the confidence to confront people who come at you with this sort of apparent certainty in their cause and their message.
Sir Simon Mayall, for a view both ancient, modern and breaking news, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and the very best of good luck to the Conservative Middle East Council, a great organisation.
Thank you.